You save a dying child, and the next morning the entire tribe stands at your door. Are they there to honor you or to judge you? The morning stage was 3 hours late, and Thomas Brennan had counted every minute of it against the cottonwood's shadow. He sat on the depot bench, turning a wet leather pouch over in his hands, still damp from yesterday's crossing, still heavy with the silver dollars that should have been in Cheyenne by now. The pouch's seams had darkened where the river water had soaked through, and he could smell the alkali mud still caught in its creases. "Stage'll be along," said Morton, the depot agent, for the 4th time that morning. Weather held up the mountain run. Thomas nodded, but kept his eyes on the road. The pouch felt heavier each time he shifted it, not from the weight of coins, but from what it represented: his sister's medical bills in Denver, the ranch mortgage coming due, the promise he'd made to their father before the old man died. $47. Not enough for any of it, but all he had. The sound of hoofbeats came from the north, but it wasn't the stage. A Lakota boy, maybe 8 years old, rode bareback on a paint horse that looked ready to founder. The child's lips were blue, his shirt soaked through, and he swayed in a way that made Thomas stand up from the bench. Morton, Thomas called, but the boy had already slid from the horse and collapsed beside the water trough. Thomas knelt beside him, felt the child's forehead, burning with fever, but shivering like it was January instead of late August. The boy's eyes opened dark, unfocused, but aware enough to try to pull away. "Easy," Thomas said. He dipped his kerchief in the trough and pressed it to the child's brow. "You're safe here." The boy spoke in Lakota, words Thomas didn't understand, but the urgency was clear enough. He pointed toward the river, then at his chest, then toward the hills, where smoke from cook fires marked the encampment 3 miles east. "Morton, get some blankets," Thomas called, "and send word to Doc Henley." "Now hold on," Morton said, stepping closer but not too close. "You know what they say about taking in. Get the blankets." Thomas's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent 5 years as a cavalry sergeant before mustering out. And the doctor. As Morton hurried inside, Thomas lifted the boy lighter than he should be, ribs showing through the wet shirt. The child's breathing was shallow, rattling. Whatever had happened at the river, whatever had brought him here, he wouldn't last the afternoon without help. Thomas carried him into the depot's back room, wrapped him in his own coat, and began the wait for Doc Henley. Outside, the stage horn finally sounded, 3 long blasts echoing off the bluffs. The wet leather pouch sat forgotten on the bench, $47 in silver, growing warm in the afternoon Sunday. By evening, the boy's fever had broken. Doc Henley had done what he could, willow, bark tea, cool cloths, and time, but it was Thomas who'd sat through the night, keeping watch, making sure the child didn't slip away. When the boy's eyes opened clear for the first time, he looked at Thomas with something between gratitude and confusion. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, though he knew the child spoke no English. The boy touched his chest and said, "Chayton." Then he pointed at Thomas, eyebrows raised in question. "Thomas." "Tom." "Tomas," the boy repeated, making it sound like music. Over the next 2 days they found ways to communicate. Chayton drew pictures in the dirt, his family's lodge, the river, himself falling from a log while trying to cross during the flash flood that had come down from the mountains. He'd been swept 2 miles downstream before catching hold of a snag. By then, the fever from the cold water had already taken hold. Thomas shared his meals, simple fare from the depot hardtack, beans, coffee for himself, and milk for the boy. The wet leather pouch stayed with him, but its urgency seemed less pressing now. The stage ran twice a week. There would be another chance. On the third morning, riders appeared on the eastern horizon. Not many 5 men, riding with the steady pace of those who have business to conduct. Thomas recognized the lead rider from his cavalry days. Chief Standing Bear, a man known for his dignity and his careful handling of the increasing tensions between his people and the territorial government. "They've come for the boy," Morton said, joining Thomas on the depot porch. "Best let them take him and be done with it." Thomas watched the riders approach. Chief Standing Bear rode a black stallion that moved like water over stone. The other 4 men were younger, warriors by their bearing, but they held their weapons casually, without threat. "Chayton," Thomas called softly. The boy emerged from the depot, still pale but steady on his feet. When he saw the riders, his face brightened. He spoke quickly in Lakota, pointing to Thomas, gesturing toward the building where he'd been cared for. The riders halted 20 feet from the depot. Chief Standing Bear dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age and walked forward. He looked at Thomas, at the boy, and then spoke in clear English. "You are the one who pulled my grandson from the river." It wasn't a question, so Thomas simply nodded. He says, "You gave him food, stayed with him when the fever came. Any man would have done the same." Chief Standing Bear studied Thomas's face for a long moment. "No, not any man." He turned to Chayton, spoke in Lakota. The boy ran to him, and the chief lifted him easily, checking his eyes, feeling his forehead with the practiced touch of someone who had raised many children. "He is well," the chief said to Thomas. "This is your doing. Doc Henley helped, and Morton here provided the blankets. But you stayed, you watched through the night." Chief Standing Bear set the boy down and stepped closer to Thomas. "In our way, such a debt requires payment. Will you accept what is offered in proper exchange?" Thomas glanced at Morton, who had gone pale. Stories of Indian raids, of settlers taken in the night, ran through every frontier town like water through a sieve. But looking at Chief Standing Bear, Thomas saw no threat, only the grave courtesy of a man handling sacred business. "I don't need payment for doing what's right. Nevertheless, payment will be made. Tomorrow, when the sun reaches the middle of the sky, I will return. Be here to receive what is offered." The chief mounted his horse, and Chayton climbed up behind him. As they rode away, the boy turned and waved. Thomas raised his hand in return, and the wet leather pouch seemed to grow heavy again in his coat pocket. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He walked the depot platform, listening to the night sounds, coyotes in the distance, the soft lowing of cattle from Henderson's spread, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves. The pouch pulled at his thoughts like a fishhook. $47. His sister's fever had been worse than the boy's, according to her last letter. The medicine she needed cost more than Thomas made in 6 months working odd jobs around the territory. He opened the pouch and counted the coins again by moonlight. Each silver dollar represented a day's work, sometimes 2. Fence repair for the Henderson spread, hauling freight for the territorial government, mucking stalls for the cavalry remount station. Honest work, but never quite enough. As dawn approached, he made his decision. When the eastbound stage came through in the morning, he would be on it. The money would go to Denver, to his sister, to the chance that she might live to see another Christmas. Whatever Chief Standing Bear intended to offer could be politely declined. Some debts, Thomas told himself, were their own reward. But even as he settled the pouch back in his coat, he found himself thinking of Chayton's smile, of the trust in those dark eyes, of the way the boy had said his name like a prayer of gratitude. The morning stage arrived precisely at 9:30, 15 minutes ahead of schedule for the first time in Thomas's memory. He stood with his small travelling bag, the wet leather pouch secure in his coat pocket, watching the driver water the horses and check the harness. "You boarding today?" the driver called. Thomas looked east toward the hills where smoke still rose from the Lakota camp. In 2.5 hours, Chief Standing Bear would arrive, expecting to find him here. To conduct business according to the old ways, the proper ways. To honor a debt that Thomas himself might not fully understand, but that clearly meant everything to the chief. "No," Thomas said, stepping back from the stage. "Not today." The driver shrugged and climbed back to his seat. "Suit yourself. Next run's Thursday." As the stage pulled away in a cloud of alkali dust, Thomas returned to the depot bench and settled in to wait. Morton emerged from the building, coffee cup in hand. "Thought you were Denver-bound this morning." "Changed my mind." Morton sipped his coffee and studied Thomas with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd spent 20 years watching human nature unfold on depot platforms. "That pouch of yours, important cargo?" Thomas's hand moved automatically to his coat pocket. "Important enough, but not as important as keeping your word to an Indian chief. I didn't give him my word. I just didn't say no when he asked me to be here. Same thing in his book. In yours too, I'd wager." At 11:30, the dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon. They came in numbers that made Morton step back into the depot doorway and Thomas's hand drift toward the colt on his hip. 20 riders, not 5. Chief Standing Bear in the lead, but behind him came the young men of the tribe, painted for ceremony, carrying lances decorated with eagle feathers and strips of colored cloth. And behind them, led by 2 older women, came the horses. Thomas had never seen such animals. Not the worn-out cavalry mounts or the stubborn freight horses that usually passed through the depot, but creatures that seemed carved from wind and starlight. Pintos and paints, a few solid blacks, 3 chestnuts that gleamed like copper in the midday Sunday. They moved with the liquid grace of wild things barely contained by human will. 20 horses, exactly 20. Chief Standing Bear dismounted and walked forward, his ceremonial dress marking this as something far more significant than Thomas had imagined. Eagle feathers in his hair, a breastplate of bone and silver across his chest, beadwork that caught and threw back the sunlight in patterns Thomas couldn't read, but somehow understood, spoke of honor, of lineage, of debts that ran deeper than money. "You stayed," the chief said. "I said I would." "No. You said nothing, but you stayed." Chief Standing Bear gestured toward the horses. "For the life of my grandson, I offer 20 horses, the finest from our herd. This is the bride price for the daughter of a chief, but it is also the proper payment for the life of a child." Thomas stared at the horses, his mind reeling. 20 horses represented wealth beyond anything he'd imagined. More than enough to pay his sister's medical bills, clear the ranch mortgage, and start over with something approaching prosperity. But accepting them would mean something more than a simple transaction. "Chief, I can't." "You can refuse," Chief Standing Bear said quietly. "This is your right. But know that refusal will leave a debt unpaid between our peoples. My grandson lives because of your actions. This cannot be forgotten or ignored." Behind the chief, the warriors sat their mounts in perfect stillness. The horses they'd brought stamped and snorted, eager to run. Thomas could smell the sweet grass in their manes, could see the intelligence in their eyes. These weren't just animals, they were symbols of everything the Lakota valued. Freedom, speed, the ability to follow the buffalo herds and live as their ancestors had lived. And they were being offered to him. "There's something you should know," Thomas said. He pulled the wet leather pouch from his pocket, hefted its weight. "I've got $47 here. It's meant for my sister in Denver. She's sick, maybe dying. I was going to take the stage this morning, but I stayed because—" He paused, not sure how to explain what he didn't fully understand himself. "Because some things matter more than money." Chief Standing Bear nodded. "This is why the horses are offered. A man who stays when he could go, who tends a sick child when he could tend only to his own concerns, such a man understands the true nature of wealth." Thomas looked at the horses again, and for a moment he could see it a different life, one where he ran his own herd, where the ranch became something his father would have been proud of. But he also saw Chayton's fever-bright eyes, heard his sister's voice in her last letter, felt the weight of promises that couldn't be measured in horses or dollars. "I'll accept," he said, "but with conditions." The warriors behind Chief Standing Bear shifted slightly, hands moving closer to their weapons. Morton let out a small whimper from the depot doorway, but the chief himself smiled the first smile Thomas had seen from him. "Speak your conditions." "5 horses. That's all I can take. The rest." Thomas gestured toward the depot, toward the town beyond. "There's a doctor here who helped your grandson. A school that could use horses for the children to learn on, families that have lost their animals to the drought. Let the 20 horses do 20 different kinds of good." Chief Standing Bear was quiet for a long time. Behind him, Thomas could hear the warriors murmuring among themselves in Lakota, could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. "You would refuse 15 horses?" the chief finally asked. "I would ask that they find homes where they're needed most. This island." Chief Standing Bear paused, seemed to be searching for words in English that could carry the weight of what he meant. "This is wisdom. But wisdom sometimes carries its own price." The next morning brought riders from 3 directions. From the east, Chief Standing Bear returned with his son and 2 tribal elders. From the north, Colonel Marcus Wade arrived with a company of cavalry, having received word that a significant Indian gathering had occurred at the depot. And from the west came Judge Harrison Blackwood, the territorial magistrate, summoned by Morton's frantic telegraph to the county seat. Thomas stood on the depot platform, watching the convergence with the calm of a man who had made his choice and would live with the consequences. The 5 horses Chief Standing Bear had given him grazed peacefully in the depot corral, the finest animals Thomas had ever owned. But it was the other 15, now distributed throughout the county, that had brought this assembly of law and authority. Brennan, Colonel Wade, called as he dismounted, his cavalry saber catching the morning light. "I understand you've been conducting unauthorized negotiations with the Lakota." "I've been accepting payment for services rendered," Thomas replied evenly. Judge Blackwood, a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his life in courtrooms rather than on the frontier, stepped forward with a ledger in his hands. "Mr. Brennan, there are laws governing trade with Indian tribes. Federal laws. You can't simply accept livestock without proper documentation and territorial oversight. With respect, Judge, I can accept payment for saving a child's life." 20 horses represents a significant transfer of wealth, Colonel Wade interjected, the kind that could destabilize relations between the territory and the tribe. "Where are these animals now?" Thomas gestured toward the town. "Doc Henley has 2 payment for his medical services. The schoolmarm, Miss Peterson, has 3 for her children to learn proper riding. Old Henrik lost his plough horses to the drought. He has 4 now. The widow Macready has 2 to help work her farm. Henderson has 3 to replace the ones that died in the dry spell, and Paulson has 2 for his freight business. You distributed them without authority, Judge Blackwood said, his voice rising. These transactions are invalid under territorial law. Chief Standing Bear, who had been listening in silence, stepped forward. Judge Blackwood, he said formally, I know your name. You presided when my nephew was tried for stealing horses he had legally purchased from a trader in Deadwood. The judge's face flushed. That's neither here nor there. Is it not? Chief Standing Bear's voice carried the authority of generations. You found those purchases invalid because they lacked proper documentation. Yet my nephew spent 6 months in your jail. Now, you tell me that my gift of horses to the man who saved my grandson's life is also invalid. I ask you, by what law does the white man's paper have more weight than the Lakota's honor? Colonel Wade's hand moved to his saber hilt. Chief Standing Bear, I won't have you question territorial authority. I question nothing. I observe. And I remember. The tension stretched like a rope under load. Thomas could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge, could see in the colonel's eyes the eagerness for a reason to act, the justification for the cavalry charge that would settle the matter in blood rather than words. From his coat pocket, Thomas pulled the wet leather pouch, $47 in silver, still carrying the smell of river mud and alkali dust. He held it where everyone could see. Judge, Colonel, he said quietly, this is what I had when I pulled that boy from the river, $47. My entire fortune meant for my sister's medical bills in Denver. I stayed here instead of taking it to her because Chief Standing Bear asked me to be present for the proper payment of his debt. He poured the coins into his palm, let them catch the sunlight. Now, I could have taken these 20 horses, sold them, and been a rich man by frontier standards. Instead, I kept 5 and asked that the rest go to people who needed them. Doc Henley, who saved the boy's life. Miss Peterson, who's teaching the next generation. Neighbors who've lost their livestock to the drought. Thomas looked directly at Judge Blackwood. You want to declare those transactions invalid? Fine, take the horses back, but know that you're taking them from a doctor who charges no fee for treating children, from a teacher who spends her own money on school supplies, from families who've lost everything to the dry years. The law is the law, Judge Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. Whose law? Chief Standing Bear asked. The law that says, my people have no right to their ancestral hunting grounds? The law that says our children cannot attend the territorial schools? The law that says a Lakota's word has no weight in a white man's court? Colonel Wade stepped forward. That's seditious talk, Chief. That's the truth, Colonel. And the truth I have learned is the most seditious thing of all. Thomas stepped between them. There's another way, he said. Judge, you want documentation? I'll provide it. Bills of sale for services rendered. Medical care, education, agricultural assistance, all legal, all proper, all recorded in your ledgers. You can't retroactively create, I can create whatever paperwork satisfies territorial law, and Chief Standing Bear can sign whatever documents confirm the legal transfer of livestock. Thomas looked at both men. Unless you'd prefer to explain to the territorial governor why his county magistrate seized horses from a doctor, a teacher, and a group of drought-stricken farmers, Judge Blackwood closed his ledger with a sharp snap. The documentation will need to be comprehensive. It will be. Colonel Wade adjusted his saber. And there will be no further unauthorized gatherings. There will be no need for them, Chief Standing Bear said. The debt has been paid, the honor has been satisfied. As the officials prepared to leave, Chief Standing Bear approached Thomas. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a small object wrapped in soft buckskin, a carved piece of bone, no bigger than a man's thumb, decorated with tiny beads and a single eagle feather. This belonged to Chayton's father, the chief said. He died 3 winters ago, hunting buffalo to feed his family. The boy wanted you to have it. Thomas accepted the carving, felt its smooth weight in his palm. It was warm from the chief's touch, and somehow seemed to pulse with its own life. Tell him I'll treasure it. Tell him yourself. He wishes to learn English, to understand the world he must grow up in. Perhaps you could teach him, as you have taught us today, that not all white men see the world through the same eyes. Thomas nodded. I'd be honored. As the various parties departed, cavalry to the south, judge to the west, Chief Standing Bear and his people to the east, Thomas stood alone on the depot platform. The wet leather pouch was empty now. The $47 spent on supplies for the horses' new owners, on the documentation Judge Blackwood required, on the telegrams necessary to make everything legal and proper. He was no richer in silver than he'd been a week ago. But in the corral behind the depot, 5 magnificent horses grazed in the afternoon Sunday. In town, 15 families had received help they desperately needed, and in his pocket, a small carved bone spoke of debts paid and honors satisfied. The eastbound stage pulled in as the sun touched the western hills. Thomas watched it arrive, watched the passengers disembark, watched the driver water his horses. This time, no one asked if he was boarding. Instead, Morton emerged from the depot with a cup of coffee and joined Thomas on the bench. "Wire came in from Denver," Morton said quietly, "about your sister." Thomas's hand tightened on the bone carving. "And?" "The fever broke 3 days ago. Doctor there says she's going to be fine. Apparently, some Eastern philanthropist heard about the drought out here, sent money to help pay medical bills for frontier families. Your sister was on the list." Thomas stared at the telegram Morton handed him, read his sister's words. "Feeling better every day. Don't worry about the bills, they've been taken care of. Come home when you can, but only when your business there is finished. Love, Mary." "Seems like your business here is just beginning," Morton observed. Thomas nodded, thinking of Chayton and the English lessons, of the 5 horses that would need proper care, of the strange web of connection and consequence that had brought him to this moment. He pulled the wet leather pouch from his coat pocket, empty now, but somehow lighter than it had ever been when full. "Seems like it," he agreed. The next morning, as Thomas worked with his new horses in the corral behind the depot, a small figure appeared on the eastern horizon. Chayton, riding his paint horse bareback, approached at an easy canter. The boy dismounted with fluid grace and walked to the fence. "Thomas," he said, his pronunciation clearer than before. "Chayton." Thomas smiled. "Ready for your first English lesson?" The boy nodded eagerly and pointed to himself. "I am Chayton. That's right. And I am Thomas. You are good man." Thomas felt the weight of the bone carving in his pocket, felt the morning sun warm on his face, heard the soft nickering of horses that had found good homes throughout the county. In the distance, the depot bell rang once, marking the hour, and somewhere a meadowlark sang. "We're all just doing what we can," Thomas said. Then, more slowly so the boy could understand, "We help each other." Chayton smiled and repeated the words, his young voice carrying them like a promise into the clear morning air. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.